Welcome to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture series. Firstly, thanks so much to the UCL team for inviting me and Elaine and setting up this series. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you all today. So in today's session, we will be exploring how concerns about climate change are shaping reproductive choices. And we're going to be centering this around the study that myself, Elaine, who is also on the call, and our colleague Laura conducted. This was a systematic review that synthesized evidence presented in 13 studies from 2012 to 2022. We'll have a Q&A section after our presentation, and you can ask questions on Slido. So if you just type in sli.do, the code is future families. It's hashtag future families, and from there you can enter questions and see other questions coming through, which you can upvote. Before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge this topic has kind of been subject to a lot of debate and controversy in the media, as we'll get into later on. So just to be clear, this presentation will be an objective overview of the evidence on this topic, and we're not wishing to influence or dismiss anybody's own personal views on this topic. So this is the research team that conducted the systematic review. I'm currently working in the climate and health research team at the Wellcome Trust, but today I am speaking in my previous capacity as a postgraduate student at the UCL Institute for Global Health, which is where we conducted this research. My colleague Laura is also part of the research team, who was a senior research fellow at the same institute. And Elaine, would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, certainly. Thank you so much, Hope. My name is Elaine Flores. I am currently a research fellow at in the planetary health at the Center on Climate Change and Planetary Health. And also I am affiliated at the Center for Global Mental Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
Perfect. So just to give you a brief overview of what this lecture is going to cover, we're going to be hopefully answering the following 4 questions. So Elaine will kick us off with an overview of the connection between climate change and mental health, and I will then dig into our research a bit more to talk through how concerns about climate change are affecting individuals' reproductive decision making. So by this I mean kind of like the direction of the relationship, what the actual specific concerns and factors are that individuals have towards climate change that are influencing their changing reproductive decisions. And then finally, thinking through some of the calls to action that this work might present for future research and implications that this might have on policy and practice priorities in this field going forward. I'm aware that we have probably quite a varied audience on the call. Some of you might be academics already working in climate health and reproductive health. Others of you might be coming from entirely different backgrounds and just have an interest in this topic, given its relevance to so many of us. So in the Q&A section at the end, please feel free to ask us to go into more depth on a particular area, or if you want clarification on a certain point or a bit of niche terminology that we've forgotten to explain, then please do also ask. For now, I will hand over to Elaine to present on some of the context on climate change and mental health that will help set the scene.
Thanks again, Hope. And thank you all for joining today's lecture. So what I will be doing is just to give an introductory overview of the complex intersection between climate change related impacts and mental health. So I wanted first to present this diagram to understand how climate change affects not only our physical environment, but also our psychological well-being. And that is a factor that is gaining increased attention, but it is also increasingly influencing major life decisions for people, including reproductive choices. So now to the top of the diagram, for example, we see like how climate change acts through multiple pathways to impact mental health. And these pathways can be direct through climate hazards like extreme heat or floods, or very indirect ones through broader environmental degradation. In the center, in the middle green section, we see that two key type of exposures will be manifesting when we say the climate change effects. We'll have environmental impacts, like affecting the food and water that we consume, and the socioeconomic disruptions, such as loss of livelihoods, forced migration, and displacement. Now, if we see the right pink section, these exposures can lead to various mental health outcomes that we have reports on. They will range from acute stress reactions to emerging constructs of psychosocial distress, like ecological grief and eco-anxiety that we are also hearing more about future climate threats. And in the bottom yellow section, we see that these impacts aren't distributed equally. So we have certain populations facing greater vulnerability due to their existing health conditions, socioeconomic status, geographic location, or social marginalization. So in practice, this means that climate change will be amplifying all the existing inequities in mental health outcomes that we see. So understanding this definitely is essential in the context for today's main lecture that Hope will be presenting. And because also anecdotally, we are aware that many young people report that climate anxiety and concerns about future environmental conditions influence their family planning decisions. In the next slide, please. So this diagram from Emma Lawrence and colleagues and Imperial helps us to visualize how climate change creates both direct and indirect impacts, rippling outward from the core environmental changes. So in the center, in the orange circle, we see the fundamental climate changes, rising temperatures, the extreme weather events, sea level rise, increasingly relevant CO2 and pollutants in the air we breathe. So these aren't just environmental metrics that we get, no? They will be triggering a cascade of effects that impact the human well-being. And when we see let's say the green ring moving outward, these changes creating immediate threats to health. Again, through several pathways that we get to see with more frequency, the heat waves, wildfires, food and water insecurity, transmittable disease spread, and social and economic instability. And then going to the turquoise ring, the threats then will be manifesting as physical health impacts, as heat stress, heart failure, malnutrition, asthma, cardiovascular disease, and importantly, mental and emotional distress. So in the outer dark blue ring that we see are the evidence that we have on the direct mental health outcomes, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideation or suicide, anxiety, depression, and grief. And importantly, this diagram will introduce also the constructs that I have mentioned linked to the indirect mental and emotional distress outcomes. So the psychological responses to environmental loss and the anticipated future changes that are being increasingly recognized in the youth and young adults of reproductive age. The next slide, please, Hope. So from the same paper, I just want you to keep in mind the flow chart, because then we can visualize how the climate change impacts will be cascading through communities affecting mental health. In terms of the rising global temperatures and increasing of the frequency and the severity of the extreme weather events that we are almost seeing reports on a daily basis. And then we see in the green boxes the impacts, how they unfold in three waves. One will be the immediate direct impacts, including physical injury, the loss of life, damages to homes and infrastructure, and also the destruction of natural environment. We will also see the longer term direct impacts affecting communities' stability through the displacement, forced migration, disrupted healthcare systems, and threatened livelihoods. And we will also be seeing the indirect impacts emerging from all witnessing the environmental degradation and the growing awareness of climate threats. So in the bottom one, then we see all the spectrum of mental health impacts that we have seen. So the responses to climate threats, as we see, vary across different individuals, the communities and contexts. And of course, we are seeing increasing evidence of climate concerns shaping individual and family planning decisions. The next slide, please. The next slide. Mm, So it is really important to understand why climate change will present such a unique psychological challenge for us. Despite the pathways and the evidence that we have seen, many people still struggle to feel personally connected to climate change. So we have a psychological distance operating across multiple dimensions, a temporal one, because future impacts and the forecast that we can see when we model it really feel far away. A spatial one when the effects will be seeming to happen somewhere else. Social dimension when it will be affecting other people. And lastly, the experiential one, as it is hard for us to link the individual weather events to global patterns. And also, interestingly, even now the terminology that we use creates barriers to engagement. When we hear terms like global warming, climate change, this can also push the issue into more abstract global sphere, making it harder for people to connect uh, climate change to our personal decisions. So two factors will be making climate change particularly challenging to grasp. One will be the natural variability in weather that is masking the long-term trends, and that the gradual changes are also harder to notice than sudden ones. However, when people experience directly the climate impacts, like the recent increase in floodings, storms, or heat waves, this often serves as a psychological turning point, transforming the abstract risks into concrete realities. Um, However, that does not always translate directly into increased concern. We have other factors like values and worldwide playing important roles. So it is a complex issue as we see. And the next slide, final for me. So finally, we have that these psychological barriers will be further complicated by social and ideological factors. We also have media representation and scientific communication creating confusion. Um, Even when the scientific consensus is clear, the public perception, of course, may lag behind or diverge significantly. So the complexity of climate information can trigger what is dubbed as learner helplessness, where people will be disengaging because the problem feels too overwhelming. And perhaps most importantly for today's discussion, our worldviews views and social groups will also be powerfully shaping how we interpret climate information. Um, so understanding these psychological social dynamics is crucial as we move into our main presentation. So this will be all for me now. Thank you. And now over to you, Hope.
Thanks, Elaine. So with that context that Elaine has just presented, I'm now going to talk us through how this is shaping reproductive decision making. So I think we're all aware reproductive decision making is clearly multifaceted, involves decisions about parenthood, whether and when to be a parent, the number and spacing of children that one might wish to have, and also it includes decisions about contraceptive use and fertility. And over the last half century, there have been significant changes in childbearing patterns, most notably in high-income countries like the UK, which have seen a greater proportion of people now choosing to abstain from parenthood and remain voluntarily child-free. This demographic shift has been linked to a number of macro-level social changes. So, for example, the 1970s feminist movement, which expanded women's reproductive rights, meant more women entered paid employment, for example, and then also more recently, the increased cost of living and the financial burden of having children, which for those of you based in the UK, you may have seen some articles on this topic cropping up in the BBC. It is worth noting, though, obviously, that these changes are culturally dependent, and so variation both within and between global north and global south contexts is likely. By global north and global south, I mean the distinction between, for example, high income and low middle income countries, developed, developing, appreciating that that's quite an oversimplified dichotomy, but I'm using those terms according to how they're presented in the literature. And more recently, climate change has emerged in both contexts as a factor feeding into people's reproductive decisions. So the three broad themes of climate change, its impact on mental health and well-being, and reproductive decision-making have kind of been united as a topic that have gained significant public attention within media polls, blog posts, and more colloquially in conversations amongst friends and family. So you can see here, these are just a few of the headlines that have come about over the last few years. And I think it's clear here that there's a narrative being formed about people's climate fears and concerns, leading them to question having children and potentially choose child-free living. And in fact, I was reading my book on Tube last week, actually, and the author commented on this notion as well. So I thought I'd just read an extract to you because it really neatly summarizes this point of view coming out of these news articles, just from one woman in particular. So this is by Lucy Jones. It's called Losing Eden, Why Our Minds Need the Wild. And she says, I worry about the long-term future of my daughter and her generation most days. I can relate to the birth strikers, a movement of women and men who have decided not to have families because they are worried about bringing children into a world of environmental collapse and widespread political inaction. This is now, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a US Congresswoman, has said, a legitimate concern for young people. When I think about my daughter's future, I recognize that we are extremely privileged to live in a wealthy country, which is less likely to be affected by climate instability than other countries. I'm also middle class and could consider, for example, moving to an area with less air pollution or extreme weather events. Many people are not as lucky. How do parents prepare for or even conceive of an unstable future for their children? So that just gives a little bit of context as to what narrative is coming out of the media. And she mentioned this group of birth strikers. So this kind of narrative has led to an emergence of new groups, for example, Birth Strike, which is a group that started in 2019 in the UK under the leadership of a woman called Blythe Pepino. And other similar groups have also emerged. So there's Conceivable Future in the US and No Future, No Children in Canada. And essentially, as well as being support groups for individuals who feel the same way about this topic, they are activist interventions that are aiming to use their reproductive power politically to push governments into taking the necessary action for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So in other words, going on strike until they're confident that the government is doing enough. In summer of 2021, Birth Strike did disband. It was this kind of leads itself to some of the debate that I was talking about earlier, but essentially this group was widely criticized as being nihilistic and spreading an anti-natalist narrative to influence people to not have children. The founder did repeatedly emphasize that this wasn't the intention, but instead wanted the emphasis to be on calling for systemic change. But ultimately, this wasn't how people interpreted the purposes of the group. So you can see already some of the tensions and controversy coming out from this topic. To complicate this even further, there is now an opposing narrative emerging in the media with people countering others' decision to not have children in the face of climate change concerns, and instead putting the emphasis on the actions of government rather than those of a parent. So this Save the Children article, one of the quotes from that states, allowing a narrative to propagate that we as individuals must stop having children in order to help prevent catastrophic global temperature rise, when 70% of our emissions come from fossil fuels, is a bit like being concerned your shed is on fire as the house burns down behind you. So I thought that was quite a poignant quote. And that just gives a flavour of some of the counter arguments that people are making to this concept. Despite this topic gaining quite a lot of public attention and becoming almost an advocacy priority, relevant empirical research remains pretty absent from the literature. And so ultimately this was the motivation for our review, to go beyond this surface level overview provided by the media and dig a bit deeper into the relationship between climate change, mental health, and reproductive decision making. So just turning to the literature now, I wanted to give some background on some of the theoretical frameworks of reproductive decision-making that are particularly relevant to this discussion and that I'll be referring back to when getting into the analysis of our findings. So the traits, desires, intentions, behaviour model is a theoretical framework of reproductive decision-making, breaking down the process into a 5-step psychological sequence. So from traits to desires, to intentions, to behaviours, and then the final outcome. It's important to note here that, and because this is something that I'll refer to later, but these discrete steps are often incorrectly used interchangeably, particularly for desire and intention. So although both of those terms describe psychological states, desires represent what someone hopes or wishes for, whilst intentions are those desires evaluated with respect to what is actually achievable in reality. So for example, there might be a number of barriers that prevent desires from becoming intentions. Moving on, the second theory is a theory of planned behaviour. And this explains that people's actions are guided by 3 main factors. So this is attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioural control. Attitudes refer to a person's positive or negative view of a behaviour's outcomes. Subjective norms capture the social pressures or expectations from others. And then perceived behavioural control is essentially a person's confidence in their ability to perform the behaviour, considering any potential obstacles. And then altogether, those 3 factors shape behavioural intentions, which are the primary predictors of actual behaviour. So this theory helps explain why climate concerns might lead some individuals to postpone or limit childbearing, while others, influenced by the differing attitudes, norms, and control perceptions, may continue to have children despite their concerns. Finally, probably the most relevant theoretical framework to this debate are demand theories of fertility. So demand theories of fertility propose that a better quality of immediate environment is conducive to larger populations because there is an abundance of natural resources. And then on the contrary, this would be reversed if the environment deteriorates, as in the case of climate change, where limited availability of resources means that some people might opt to control and limit their reproduction. There are critiques of this position that propose that a decline in agricultural productivity would lead people to increase their crop cultivation to fulfill their subsistence needs. And then consequently, families might decide to have more children to have a larger labour force to gather the crops and get more resources. So, returning to the questions that I promised that we'd answer at the start, the research question for our review was, how do climate change related concerns affect individuals' reproductive decision-making? And just to be clear, in this instance, we defined climate change related concern as any negative emotional response towards events associated with the anthropogenic root causes of climate change, in addition to previously witnessed and future projected consequences of climate change. I realise that's a bit of a lengthy definition to wrap your head around. The objectives were threefold. So firstly, we wanted to summarise all of the available evidence, so the quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods evidence that investigated how climate change related concerns link to reproductive decision-making. The second objective was to explore the specific environmental concerns and factors shaping people's reproductive attitudes and decisions, so understanding the reasons why people's concerns are factoring into their childbearing decisions. And then finally, again, the third was to make future recommendations for research, policy, and practice. I won't go into the specifics of the methodology just for time purposes, but if you're interested, you can read in more detail in the paper. But just to quickly go over some of the important aspects. So the exclusion criteria wasn't extensive. We didn't want to unnecessarily exclude any studies. So there were no restrictions on location or study design or the date of publication. The target population was any individual that connected climate change with their reproductive decisions. And this was regardless of if the person had pre-existing children, as well as any other factor, including age, partner, financial stability, etc. They just anything that might be contributing to their reproductive decision-making, as long as climate change concerns were factoring in. The exposure was current climate change related concerns, which didn't include any positive emotional response that might come about towards climate change. And finally, the outcome was prospective, so thinking about decisions in the future rather than retrospective, so past reproductive decision making. And just before getting into the findings, I wanted to raise a couple of limitations of this methodology in the review. So the quantitative studies that were included were all cross-sectional, meaning that it was at a specific time point. So that evidence is a need for more longitudinal studies that could potentially observe changes in attitudes over an individual's life course. And most of the studies were conducted in global north countries, so we really need further research that addresses this issue among global south populations. And finally, given it was only English language papers that were included, we might have missed some relevant papers written in other languages. So now getting on to the findings. So after we screened the databases, 13 studies were identified for inclusion within the review. 5 of those were quantitative, 6 were qualitative, and 2 were mixed methods. And all of the studies included a total sample size of close to 12,000 participants. So most of these 11 were conducted in global north countries, which included the US, Canada, UK, Ireland, New Zealand, and several European countries, and 2 were in global south countries, which were Zambia and Ethiopia. And 12 of the studies reported that stronger climate change concerns are associated with a reduced desire and intention to have children. So this aligns with the dominant direction of the relationship that we're seeing in the media and that extract that I read from that book. And you might have noticed that I've separated desire and intention here. This is alluding to that difference that I highlighted coming out in the literature, where desires are what someone hopes or wishes for, and intentions are desires evaluated with respect to what's actually achievable in reality. So for example, in Zambia and Ethiopia, some of the participants desired fewer children to meet their subsistence needs during periods of declining agricultural productivity. But then in the end, this didn't align with their intention, as they lived in the reality of shortages in contraception provision. Additionally, the quantitative findings were divided into reproductive attitudes and intentions. And interestingly, while the influence on reproductive attitudes clearly showed that stronger concerns about climate change were associated with less favourable attitudes towards having children, intentions, on the other hand, were mixed, and it showed that essentially more might be at play here, and other factors might be swaying people's reproductive decisions that might have taken priority, and we'll get into that a bit later. And then you'll see here 4 out of the 13 studies found weaker evidence So you'll see that 12 and 4 don't match up, but one found this like opposing finding, and 3 of the studies had mixed results. So 4 of the studies found that climate change concerns were associated with an increased reproductive intention for some people. And the reason that I say weaker evidence here was because the quantitative studies that found this relationship only used a single item measure of concern that was on a binary scale. So from strong, either someone had strong concerns or someone had no strong concerns. And essentially that ignores the continuous nature of mental health issues. So it meant that a significant amount of that variable's information was lost. And this is just a map to give you an idea of where the studies were conducted. You can see that they are predominantly in the global north with a particular focus on the US. And then only 2 studies came from the global south in Africa, in Zambia and Ethiopia. Just going to have a quick filter. Okay, moving on to the second objective of the review. The qualitative findings all sought to understand the specific concerns that motivated participants' reproductive decision-making. So there were 4 key perspectives that explained participants' decreased desire or intention for children. So firstly, ethically, participants were concerned about their child's health and well-being in an uncertain future that's confronted by the effects of climate change. They expressed not wanting the responsibility, essentially, of raising a child in a world that they envisioned as doomed as a result of climate change. And in particular, participants in one study felt essentially like the future state of the planet was out of their control, so they didn't want the responsibility of raising a child in their envisioned uninhabitable world. And you can see a couple of quotations coming out of the qualitative studies here. So the first one, it does feel like kind of a gamble, bringing a very young person into a world that you really are very unsure about the future of. And secondly, I don't want to birth children into a dying world. So the narrative expressed here is actually echoed in the conceptualization of an ecological ethic of reproduction, which came from Katie Dow, for those of you that know her. And this encourages prospective parents to look beyond their individual nuclear family to the broader environment, which will represent the conditions into which a child will be born. So the second consideration that influenced people's reproductive decision-making came from an environmental standpoint. And participants were concerned about the environmental impact of reproduction as a result of contributing to overpopulation by having a child, and then subsequently said child contributing to overconsumption of resources. So in one study, a number of individuals felt that not having children was the best thing that they could do to reduce their carbon footprint. And there's been a study from Wines that concluded that actually having one fewer child was the highest impact action that someone could take to reduce their personal emissions. So just to demonstrate, these were some of the comments, again, coming from participants. So the first one, the child would contribute to destroying biological diversity by being a consumer. And the second one, the decision not to have children is intertwined with trying to minimize our impact on the environment. Interestingly, these concerns weren't expressed by the participants in Zambia and Ethiopia. And so that might be reflective of their relatively negligible involvement in overconsumption practices. But this is kind of where the debate and controversy happens, because this finding highlights one of those really contentious debates that proliferates. Basically, because focusing on overpopulation discourses has been critiqued as quite reductive and racist, given that consumption, which is aggravated by a capitalist way of living, is considered the primary anthropogenic driver of climate change. And it also links to like a neo-Malthusian ideology, which holds that human population growth can easily outstrip its food resources. if it's not held in check by artificial birth control measures, therefore essentially arguing that people should have fewer children. But this argument really critically ignores the history of population control that has existed in many countries. So, for example, compulsory sterilization in India in the 70s, China's one-child policy. So it's argued that this way of thinking can be used to justify the curtailing of sexual, reproductive, and human rights of people. So just to give a bit of context to that, but to say nevertheless, this was a concern that did feature in many participants' narratives. So the ethical concerns and environmental concerns were the predominant considerations that shaped reproductive decision-making. However, another concern related to livelihood, and this was only found in the studies conducted in Zambia and Ethiopia, where participants were concerned about their families' ability to subsist during periods of seasonal drought, given many communities had a dependence on rain-fed agriculture, which they knew would continue getting worse with climate change. And therefore, they felt that having a smaller family would be more advantageous during poor environmental conditions to ensure their family's survival. And so heightened demand for family planning services was observed among participants' narratives. Given this finding was unique to the studies from Zambia and Ethiopia, this could imply that, the transition from desires to intentions might be more challenging, given that these countries have generally weaker sexual and reproductive health service provision, and at times where reproductive rights is still a taboo subject. So these are a couple of the quotations again. So someone saying, the 6 children I desire to have may not have enough food to eat. And the second one, everyone needs to have children based on the resources that they have. Finally, this factor was only observed among just a handful of participants in one study, which related to environmental politics and the possible opportunity cost of parenting, which would use up energy and time that could be better spent on being a climate activist. Some people also felt that their reproductive choices could be used as a socio-political tool, such that by professing not to have children as a result of climate change, it might actually influence environmental attitudes among their family members. And for a couple of participants, they had a similar standpoint to birth strike, which is what I mentioned earlier. And they reported that they were refusing to have children on a more public scale as a method of striking. So again, a quotation here, I'm relieved that I did not have a child because this choice gives me more time to dedicate to political activities and activism. Okay, so we've explored the reasons why people have a less favourable attitude to having children as a result of their concerns about climate change. But actually, these two final factors, so livelihood and political, were turned on their heads as reasons why some participants intended to have more children or to continue having children despite their climate change concerns. So firstly, some participants from the study in Ethiopia felt that by having a greater number of children, that would be an asset, as they provide agricultural and pastoral labour that could be used to acquire more resources in a deteriorating environment. So this quotation here, my desire was to have 10 children so that some of them can help me because no one knows what the future holds. Now this, going back to the demand theories of fertility that I mentioned earlier, this idea supports those and is observed in other global south countries, like, for example, Bangladesh and Nepal. Children are seen as helping hands during difficult times to support with domestic work, as well as kind of water and wood collection. And also, these concerns might be linked to theories of insurance births, where women in unfavourable environmental conditions might have more children to compensate for the risks to child mortality. So again, to reiterate, this is another example in which the transition from reproductive desires to intentions might be more challenging in countries that have a dependency on children to provide support. And finally, political. Some participants from one study in the US believed that parents are more invested in environmental politics due to their connections to a distant future through having children. So they therefore viewed childbearing as almost like a strategic action to support and nurture their children to be future environmentalists that would contribute to a better world. So this notion reflects the fear that has been documented among some people that by not having children, they would widen the political fertility gap in the US. And this is a phenomenon that conservative adults are having greater numbers of children than liberal adults. And therefore, this would negatively affect the environment as a new generation of majority conservatives or Republicans would be born that didn't care about the climate crisis. Obviously, this is a very, very broad generalization, but that was a concern that remained among some of the participants. So just a quotation here, I thought about how I will raise my kids to be educated about climate change and how they can be a force for good for fighting it. So already, these four themes show that the links between concerns about climate change and reproductive decisions aren't very clear cut, and there's a whole host of considerations that are factoring into people's reproductive decision making. It becomes even more complicated when you factor in the extent to which these environmental concerns are affecting reproductive decisions compared to other societal norms around reproduction and additional individual beliefs. So, for example, in Zambia, the men interviewed described having the gendered social obligation in their society to have a large number of children. And the same expectation was noted for Ethiopian women who were granted prestige in their community if they have more children. Other people also reflected on the relatively minimal impact their individual environmental behaviours would have compared to government intervention as a reason to still have children, and they felt that the onus shouldn't be placed on their personal actions, as this deflects from the responsibilities of big corps and governments who hold far more power to mitigate and adapt to climate change. There were also other considerations such as financial concerns, partner preferences, so it really did become clear that climate change was seldom the only factor shaping reproductive decision-making. Another interesting finding was the distinction between the studies in the global north versus the global south, which shows that this relationship isn't generalizable on a global scale. And if we think about this in the context of broader discourses of reproductive freedom, it's important to remember that many people might not have the ability or the privilege to choose whether or how many children that they have. So I think ultimately this highlights the highly situated nature of environmentally child-free behaviour as organised along kind of social class hierarchies that are prevalent both within and between global north and global south settings. So finally, moving on to the third objective, this work revealed a number of suggestions for further research and recommendations for policy and practice. Within research, the review highlighted a need for further investigation in global south settings. Differences in structural constraints such as contraception between the global north and the global south were noted, which ultimately would lead to differing responses to climate change concerns and reproductive decisions, both within and between this geographical divide. Additionally, the studies presented in the review focused on a very specific aspect of reproductive decision-making, which is whether or not to have children. But it would also be interesting to analyse the influence of climate change concerns on reproductive timing, so birth spacing, or maybe people might choose to delay or accelerate their timeline for having a child. Additionally, given all of the quantitative studies included in the review were cross-sectional, as I mentioned before, having more longitudinal cohort studies would be really advantageous. And then finally, only 35 participants out of nearly 12,000 overall identified as gender diverse. So by this, I mean people on the continuum between binary male and binary female. And so given that gender diverse people are, research has shown that they are particularly vulnerable to both the effects of climate change and adverse mental health, more research, including these participants, would be better. And then with respect to policy and practice, it's clear that public policy has a complex role to play in reproductive choices, especially as concerns about climate change grow. On the one hand, there's obviously an increased need for investment into mental health service provision, and mitigation of public anxiety towards climate change might actually be supported by greater prioritization of climate change within political agendas in order to help people feel more secure about their future. And finally, as mentioned previously, promotion of accessibility of family planning services, as well as access to subsidized contraception, would allow individuals in the Global South to be in control of their reproductive lives and therefore foster a sense of climate resilience among these populations. So, in conclusion, ultimately, this research has highlighted a very complex relationship between climate change concerns and reproductive decision-making. There were a number of considerations from ethical, environmental, livelihood, and political standpoints that contributed to a reconsideration of their reproductive decision-making, predominantly leading people to have a reduced desire and intention to have children, but for some there was an increase. Ultimately, this review serves as a call to action, really, for greater research into the climate change, mental health, and reproductive decision-making nexus, and also demonstrates a need for collaboration among policymakers to incorporate local level environmental concerns within national and international climate change, mental health, and sexual and reproductive health policies. Thank you, and I think we will now be turning to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Hope. Oh, great. Yeah, so the QR code for people to be able to access the paper. So we have received some questions. I will also invite again the audience to enter slide.do and the event code hashtag future families if you want to add anything. So the first one that we have would be, how might climate change concerns be influencing decisions around adoption as opposed to biological children, to having biological children? Maybe would you like to have a go at that, Hope?
Yeah, of course. It's a very, very interesting question, and from my knowledge, one that's definitely been underexplored in the literature. So I'm just going to go off the findings that we presented here and suggest, I guess, for the people that are concerned about the environmental impacts of overpopulation and overconsumption associated with raising additional children, adoption would be technically seen as like a climate conscious choice for them, because particularly if they were or also have like positive experiences towards reproduction, because they wouldn't be contributing to overpopulation. The child is already on the planet. And then for those that had ethical concerns around raising a child in an uncertain future, maybe some people might feel that adopting would offer a way to provide stability and support for a child who is already facing the world's uncertainties. I guess also for those interested in environmental politics, they might feel that they can nurture a child to become more passionate about sustainability and be an environmentalist in the future. So I'm just going off those and thinking through how it might affect adoption rates. But I'd say as concerns about climate change become more common, adoption also might continue to grow as a preferred option for those that kind of wish to align their family planning with environmental concerns. But yes, I to my knowledge, it's been quite understudied in the literature, but
That is great. Yeah, I think that definitely is something interesting. We have other question that I think that you have already highlighted during the presentation. Is there a correlation between social class and concerns for having children during a climate crisis?
Another really interesting question. I'm not sure that I don't think I did highlight this in the paper because I think again, I mean it's just such an understudied area.
Not social class by itself, but yeah, I am guessing that it will definitely be to a higher socioeconomic status. And yeah, definitely, I don't think that there was like for social class by itself, like a paper that, I mean, that reported something like that as a measure, but a proxy would be having a higher social class. And of course, there is also a very limited amount of papers from the Global South exploring that, but an economic concern would be a barrier, definitely.
Yeah, and I guess I probably did comment on this slightly that those from a higher social class do actually have that privilege to be able to choose whether or not they have children, they have access to. I mean, for people coming from Zambia and Ethiopia, it was a very practical decision about whether to have children that was having children in order to like acquire resources, basically. So some people chose to have fewer children in order that they had enough food to feed their families. Other people had more children, so they had more helping hands, as one study said, in order to acquire more resources. So actually, yeah, there is a correlation, but I'd be intrigued for a study on social class within a particular country and how that differs, because predominantly we just saw those distinctions between global north and global south.
That is great. Yeah, I think that well, the next one I can also try and give a response. For the question, how can we overcome the psychological barriers and motivate more people to take action on climate change, especially when it comes to personal decisions? Um, well, I can give it a go, and then maybe you can provide any additional thoughts on this. But definitely, yeah, this is quite important from what we have discussed. Overcoming psychological barriers as the cognitive biases, social influences is critical, but it is not we don't have like only one magical solution. It requires a multi-pronged approach. In terms of improving climate communication, maybe having a more localized, using personal framings can help making the climate hazards and the threats feel more tangible and more immediate, prompting people to action, and also focusing on solutions rather than just the problems can also foster a sense of agency. Um, Also, and that is really important in terms of community engagement. How can we promote that? Building support networks and also using champions. No, we need to highlight local climate leaders uh, to also make the climate action feel more socially normalized and empowering rather than isolating. That is something that we're seeing now when people join together and also protest for something that is affecting their own communities and also taking action in terms of rather than this feeling of powerlessness. And of course, acknowledging, I mean, because we have underlying values and worldviews that will not be the same. So we need to acknowledge that people's belief about climate change are also deeply tied to their self-identity. So we also need to meet people where they are in terms of finding and appealing to their core values that may be way more effective than just, and that is especially for us that work in academia, that just presenting the facts, presenting the reports. So I think that if we want to catalyze a meaningful behavior change on these issues, we definitely need a more holistic strategy, tackling both, tackling psychological, social, cultural dimensions, because as we have seen, it's a complex challenge, but it is an essential one that we need to overcome.
I think I just emphasize your point around creating kind of a positive outlook on the solutions. I think for far too long we've had this kind of quite gloomy, and it obviously is very gloomy, the outlook on climate change, but actually behavioral psychology suggests that that isn't going to influence people to change, and actually having in the back of their minds that there is actually a way out, and there is like ways to mitigate and adapt to this, and think you can do things on an individual level is really important for motivating people to take action. And for example, connecting climate change with physical health and mental health, and making people aware of how climate change will impact people's health actually then connects it to themselves rather than this broader environment. If you're actually thinking about it in the context of how it will directly affect you, I think that then goes some way to making people understand what the consequences are going to be, but also thinking about how we can work together to solve it.
Yes, definitely. Well, I'm really conscious about the time, but I think that we have time for a last question. One that I think, I mean, you presented very well about the research recommendations, but the question would be, what role can policymakers and institutions play supporting people as in this specific challenge? No, people are grappling with climate change in their family planning decisions. So, I mean, I can also contribute something about that. I think that this this is a critical role. Policymakers and institutions need to create an enabling environment for people to be informed, and also having support. Supporting their choices about reproduction in facing this climate crisis. So definitely having some education, public education campaigns, funding research to improve climate change literacy, focusing also in the mental health impacts and its links to reproductive decisions, and healthcare, reproductive healthcare, and in ensuring that there is access to high quality services, family planning services. People need to have the resources and autonomy to make these choices. And also the policies that provide economic security, housing stability, and factors in the community that also empower the resilience will be definitely, as you have presented in the results. We don't have a lot of data, but nevertheless, we know that it can influence people's willingness to have children in this uncertainty. And also maybe partnering with local stakeholders, trusted institutions, maybe religious institutions, cultural ones that enable this type of dialogues about the ethical dimensions of reproduction in a changing climate, no? Encompassing, the diverse worldviews and value systems that people have. So yeah, definitely it's an approach that requires an all hands on deck with collaboration across sectors and to be able to address this complex interplay.
Yeah, and I think in the final minute, I'd probably just say also, I think policymakers could really like promote climate education for people that kind of fosters a sense of resilience, and actually then allows people to have a sense of agency as to what they can do and to improve the climate, and what is actually happening. So yeah, advancing climate policies and education might be able to mitigate people's anxiety and concerns about what's to come.
That is great. Thank you so much, Hope, and thank you for the organizers. I think it will be a thought-provoking event if in the recording people will be able to also to share and see. So thank you so much for attending today's lunch hour lecture. We also want to remind you and invite you all to the next one that it will take place on the next 12th of November. The topic will be Beyond Ofsted, the future of school inspections. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.